Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report.
I'm Stacy Herbert.
So, my little desert flower, tell me everything.
Max, the French banks are on fire.
Alex Schaefer, noted artist of burning banks, he needs to get here to paint this stuff.
That's right. You know, Moody's has downgraded SocGen and Credit Agricole, and the banks are on fire here. But that brings me to this headline here, Max. And this is from Glenn Beck's website, theblaze.com, and it's an author who goes by the name of Buck Sexton, who says he's been in the U.S. intelligence community for 6 years. And he writes, anti-capitalist artist makes big bucks off flaming banks. And it refers to the Keiser Report and its guest, Alex Schaefer, who, for one Los Angeles-based painter, scenes of anti-capitalist anarchy have really paid off.
Yes, well, the so-called intelligence agent worker dude seems to have gotten it all wrong.
Well, of course, these are the same sort of people who complain about big government, and he himself worked for big government. And he's talking about these fantasies of the left wing of burning banks, neglecting the fact that Alex Schaefer mentioned in his own interview that it's not about people burning down the banks, but the banks burning the infrastructure of our banking system, of burning our money and destroying our money. And also the other thing he points out, he alludes to the fact that because the police visited Alex Schaefer, this is proof that he's anti-capitalist, and kept on pointing out that the police visited Alex Schaefer to discuss this art that was so disturbing. And it reminded me of a story that Pablo Picasso told about his famous artwork, Guernica. Guernica being, of course, the town in Basque Country, Spain, which was carpet bombed by the Italians and Germans at the behest of the fascists in Spain. A few years later, he's in Paris, and he's visited by the Nazi occupying officers. And pointing to a poster of Guernica, the Nazi officer said, "Did you do that?" Pablo Picasso responded, "No, you did it."
Oh, Pablo. Look, Beck is an American banking fascist sympathizer. He's a collaborator with American banking fascists, and his ratings are crashing.
But again, this point that Pablo Picasso, the artist, made to the fascist Nazis, it's not me that did what is depicted in my artwork, it's you. Alex Schaefer is saying, the bankers did this, I didn't do it, I am just depicting what I see.
Well, this is what happens when you have a country that takes what's in the Bible literally. Here they see a painting which is art, which is metaphorical, which is representative, which is a symbolic gesture, and they can't help but take it literally because they simply are low information population that doesn't have the mental faculties to think above that kind of general IQ level of a net.
Max, the bank referenced in the painting by Alex Schaefer is JP Morgan Chase, which, as we pointed out here on the Keiser Report, Jamie Dimon, their CEO, said he only took $25 billion from the government as his patriotic duty. So one wonders if Alex Schaefer would now be referred to as a patriot had he accepted government bailouts.
Right, if the cops gave him $25 billion on the spot, that would make him a patriot. The fact that he's calling attention to fascism in America is something Glenn Beck never does. He's considered an anti-American.
And the biggest proof that this guy on Glenn Beck's site, theblaze.com, gets it all wrong is he mentions that the buyer of Alex Schaefer's art for big bucks at $25,200 is a German art collector.
As if anybody in America could afford a nice piece of art. What do you got? 60 million in America on food stamps, more than 120 million at or below the poverty line. Nobody in there can afford art anymore. It's a luxury for people with functioning democratic states like people in Germany.
But the reason why they can't afford it is because they do not have capitalism. The thing that this guy, Buck Sexton, claims is capitalism is oligarchy. It's the opposite of capitalism. It does not exist. The only person that could afford to buy this artwork at $25,000 for big bucks is a guy who is an economy that still creates wealth. Germany still creates wealth through manufacturing and exporting. But You know, there's some new artwork that Alex Schaefer is working on. And so he was outside another Chase Bank out in Pasadena. People were stopping him all over because they recognized him from our television show. He said that a banker stopped and said, one guy who said he works in finance and is a self-described capitalist pig gave me the biggest kudos of all. So Max, this made me think of another capitalist society, which is China. And that you had workers at these fake Apple stores all across China who actually thought they were working at an Apple store, but they were fake Apple stores. And this guy who says he works in finance and is therefore a capitalist pig, he really thinks he's working at a capitalist organization.
Well, exactly. He believes that his job working in the bank is commensurate with something called capitalism. He doesn't really want to admit that he's in the counterfeiting business. Alex Schaefer is creating original works of art. Banks counterfeit money. Bernanke, Geithner, anyone in the banking business is just an out-of-control rogue counterfeiting, naked short-selling weasel.
Well, Alex Schaefer is responding in his art to the burnt-out economy around him. So this takes me to another headline by another Murdoch organization, Dow Jones. Massive default is best way to fix the economy. This is a commentary from Brett Ahrens. And he's saying that default, Chapter 11, massive default across the entire U.S. is the way to fix the economy. He said because it isn't too much government or too little government that has caused their problem. It isn't red tape, high taxes, low taxes, the growing divide between the rich and poor, too much government debt, too little government debt, corporations, poor people, greed, socialism, China, Greece, or the legalization of gay marriage. In short, it's debt, too much debt. There's $13.3 trillion in consumer debt, and you've got to get rid of it.
Well, that's true. They've simply created more debt than they will ever be able to pay, and there will be some kind of structural default, a reorganization, a Bretton Woods type agreement, where the world's currencies are recalibrated, and the U.S. dollar will be devalued by at least 50%. Everything in America will double in price, and the tragedy, like the people working in the 9/11 towers who weren't told that they were on the front line of a financial war, the tragedy is that Americans are not being told that they're about to have their clocks cleaned by the global bankers.
And he points out that many Americans, probably driven on by his master, Rupert Murdoch, say, we can't ever allow people to default. That is not an option. It doesn't exist. That would be letting them get away with it. But he said at the moment, by not letting these people default, we're letting the banks get away with bad decisions. The banks are supposed to be heroes of capitalism, the patriotic patriots who receive $25 billion from the government in order to be patriots. And he's saying that's part of capitalism. These guys, there has to be risk, because without risk, then there can't be reward.
Well, you mentioned Jamie Dimon earlier, and in the context of who's breaking the law, Jamie Dimon, who's CEO of JP Morgan, came out this week and saying that we should just walk away from the Basel III agreements, which is the global requirement for minimum capital in a bank. And I know, and anyone in the banking industry knows, and I can say definitively right here, without fear of any retribution, that Jamie Dimon and JP Morgan have broken the law consistently every quarter for the past 10 years by failing to meet those requirements. That's against the law. He breaks the contract every single minute of every single day. He breathes air. Jamie Dimon breaks many laws. That's just one, and we can name 20 laws. The fact that he's not in jail is the riddle of the ages.
No, Max, I think it shows you the power of the zombie. There are zombie banks everywhere, and they rule our world. And I want to do a little quick headline here that shows you the high cost of maintaining zombies. Cost of dying rises above £7,000. A survey in the UK shows that funeral costs have risen by 61% over the past 7 years. This is a direct result of all these zombie banks being supported by the Fed, all the counterfeiting that you talked about.
Right, zombies are being kept alive. Japan, of course, zombie country for 20 years. The banks should have been allowed to fail 20 years ago. They've been pumped up with cheap money. They're zombie banks. American banks, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, they should have failed long ago because they took terrible decisions, and they should be bankrupt. They're insolvent. They're technically insolvent, but they were kept alive with fiat plasma that they become zombies walking the face of the earth. The French bank, Societe Generale, BNP, the walking dead.
And then here's another sign of just how wrong Glenn Beck's website is about whether or not America or those against the bankers are the anti-capitalists. Corporations tailoring product lines to reflect growing income inequality. So as of 2010, the richest 20% of the US population control 84% of the wealth, and the 400 richest Americans have a higher net worth than the full 50% of households at the bottom. Because of this, there's no middle to which these corporations can even sell things. They just don't exist. So they're only tailoring things to either the diamond and platinum and gold and silver crowd, or the people who can't even afford Walmart. They have to put these things on layaway.
Yeah, well, it's slavery. You know, in America, they had slavery, then they outlawed slavery, but in its place were the Jim Crow laws. Coloreds only, whites only. Then the banks got involved, and they have financial Jim Crow laws. If you're black and living in the ghetto, you are charged 40, 50, 60% to borrow money. If you're white and you work on Wall Street, you're charged negative 5% to borrow money. That's a financial Jim Crow law that goes down color lines. Now the big corporations who realize America is becoming a new plantation of slaves, they're saying, forget it, we don't even make a pretense that there's a middle class. Here's a product for those living on the plantation, and here's the product for the man living in the big house.
The article goes on to point out that while corporations are now aiming for high and low end only, the trend of this widening income gap in the absence of a middle class goes back to, they say, the 70s. Because while wages and productivity rose in tandem during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, they became decoupled in about 1980 as productivity continued to climb while wages slumped and then recovered only modestly. What happened in 1980, Max?
Off the gold standard.
And also deregulation of the banking sector.
Right, which was made possible by no tethering to something that you could actually have an accounting of, which is gold. So you just had the beginning of this pyramid of fraud, which has resulted now in slavery once again in America.
And finally, here on this story, about proof that it's not a capitalist society in America, it points to the Gini coefficient index in America as being 0.468, and 0 being perfect equality, everybody has equal wealth. 100 would have been one person owned all the wealth. So they're saying that other nations that have had Gini coefficients similar to the United States include Philippines, Ecuador, and Rwanda.
Remember, America, they hate you for your freedoms. All right, Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Don't go away, much more coming your way, so stay right there. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to Atlanta, Georgia, and speak with Aaron Crown of MLimplode.com, otherwise known as Mortgage Lender Implode-O-Meter, where you can track the number of mortgage lenders that have imploded. So far, a total of 387 implosions since 2006. Aaron, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Hey, Max, it's great to be here.
Okay, Aaron, let's talk mortgage fraud. The only major conviction of the mortgage crisis has been that of Taylor Bean Whitaker, CEO of Lee Farkas. Tell us about the company and their collapse, and also about your tip-off to the FHFA a year before the company collapsed.
Taylor Bean was committing a variety of frauds started by Lee Farkas, and the genesis of that was to cover up a bank overdraft that he created with the partner bank Colonial Bank. And it's a very sordid affair, but basically he saw as a ripe opportunity would be to multiply sell the same mortgages or mortgages with the same assets backing them, or essentially no assets backing some of them, and to get pre-funded via Freddie Mac for mortgages that hadn't been sold yet, which is of course illegal. So a variety of these things went on for years and years and years. And a year before the 2009 collapse of Colonial Bank, a whistleblower went to us, and we researched their tip. The tip was essentially about the Freddie Mac aspect of the fraud, and we researched it, and it checked out, and so we reported it. And essentially, FHFA sat on it and did nothing. And we recently confirmed that, it was our tip that it had been referred to in a Inspector General report for FHFA that said, hey, the complaint procedures at FHFA are totally messed up because this is an example of, a glaring whistleblower report that was essentially ignored.
Aaron Crown, we recently interviewed the former U.S. Assistant Secretary to Housing, Catherine Austin Fitts. She said that when she tried to clean up the mortgage lending fraud, she essentially became an enemy of the state and was driven out of town. Have things changed much?
I would say no, because there's been no sunshine effort and no effort for reform. And I'm very familiar with Catherine Fitz's work, and the more I delved into that recently, the more the things with FHFA and Taylor Bean and FHA started to make sense. Let me give you an example. We're also engaged in a frivolous lawsuit battle with a company that specialized in getting people out of their FHA mortgage down payment requirement. FHA had a minimal down payment requirement of 3%, and there was a whole cottage industry of companies that were set up to essentially launder money from the builders and the other sellers to make it look like a charitable donation towards that 3% down payment. And one of our bloggers wrote about one of these scams where they laundered the money through an Indian tribe, of all things, and they sued us. And the funny thing is, they sued us for libel after Congress had passed a law in 2008 that unambiguously outlawed this. There was no question about it. They were shutting down their own business, but they were so self-conscious about somebody noticing this scam, which is running through FHA, that they sued us to try to silence us. And my subsequent digging filed some Freedom of Information Act requests and things like that. It's about a $100 billion racket, and probably unappreciated in the extent that it contributed to both inflating and popping the housing bubble. So that's the kind of thing that's at stake here. That's the kind of size of these scams, if at least minimally questionable activities running through government-backed mortgage and asset-backed programs. And it's so this is right on with what Catherine Fitts had been finding and was trying to ring the bell on.
Yeah, what I don't understand is when people ask the government, how come you're not following up on these frauds that are eventually identified by regulatory agencies, but there's a lot of foot dragging and no convictions. The government will say, well, we're understaffed, we're overworked, we just don't have the money for it. And yet, when all this research is being provided pro bono by independent analysts like yourself, effectively cutting the cost out of the government from having to do this legwork, the conclusion one has to have is that the government is complicit in fraud directly. Would you disagree with that?
No, actually, it goes a lot deeper. It's not just an implied thing, but we know there were cases where the fraud was brought to them and they knew about it at the highest levels, and they essentially chose not to do the right thing, which is to refer it to the Justice Department for prosecution. And that's not necessarily an expensive thing, especially when all the research is done, like you said. But a few targeted lawsuits that attack this kind of fundamental fraud that's both inflating the market and wasting taxpayer resources are not expensive to do and would have an amazing deterrent effect. But they did not do it. And the more I've researched this, the more it seems clear that the reason they did not do it, one, there was, for the officials involved, such as Cuomo, they're looking to build a stable of people who will contribute to their campaigns in the future. Two, there's the aspect of they're trying to pad their own numbers. Not so much in the case of FHA that they're looking to increase bonuses and their own payouts and things like that, but in the case of Fannie and Freddie, that was certainly the case, where they not only wanted to hit minority homeownership numbers, quote unquote homeownership, but to also increase their own personal payouts. And of course, we know that was in the midst of a giant Enron-esque accounting scandal that was essentially nobody was punished. Frank Raines left with his golden parachute. So, it's absolutely a swamp. And there's direct knowledge and complicity that is totally unambiguous.
Aaron Crown, what are SLAPP suits and what are the implications for bloggers?
That stands for Strategic Litigation Against Public Participation. And an example of that is the suit that I mentioned earlier by the FHA launderers against us. And the motivation there is to basically silence the critic or whistleblower, someone who's ringing the bell on fraud, that some sort of racketeer, politically blessed patron does not want to be public. a lot of times the information is out there for these sort of things, but when a high-profile blogger or other media source, especially independent media, starts talking about it and writing about it, it raises the level of scrutiny. So oftentimes you'll get essentially a frivolous libel or defamation suit, and the plaintiff, they know that they would not prevail in trial because the facts are against them, or at minimum, the person or reporter, blogger had a right to say what they said and opine as they did. You know, we have nominally at least, a general right to free speech. So, you know, that's the setup. But they don't expect to win at trial. What they expect to do is either intimidate the person speaking into being silent, or to run them down with legal bills. And you know, we've always chosen to protect our writers and bloggers and our sources, and that has essentially cost us what would have been all the profit of our little fledgling media company. And you know, today it's ML Implode is kind of reverted to a one-man operation because of these costs, but I do feel that it's a battle worth fighting.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Angelo Mozilo, of course, former CEO of Countrywide. Countrywide, along with Merrill Lynch, acquired by Bank of America. Bank of America, once again, rumored to be bankrupt, needed an emergency cash infusion from Warren Buffett, still being talked about in terms of being bankrupt. But the seed of all this, Angelo Mozilo, poster child for mortgage fraud, where is he today?
He's apparently kicking back with some fruity drinks on an island somewhere. I mean, you know, he got out with a wrist slap in the civil suit by the shareholders, and there was nothing criminal essentially. You know, this is a larger problem, Max, with the way the government operates and the way the financial regulatory regime operates. Is they're generally happy to go in. Regardless of how steep the wrongdoing and how clear it is, go in and settle for a tiny fine, which sadly becomes just the cost of doing business for these companies and doesn't really change the modus operandi. So that certainly applied to Countrywide in spades while Mozilo was there. And now, you know, we see that Bank of America has inherited that mess. This is something we warned against when it was going on in 2008, the potential takeover. Of course, you know, the major bank in the country isn't going to pay attention to us, so they went and took over this toxic waste dump. They thought they were getting it cheap, and the joke is on them. Mozilo sloughed this junk off to Bank of America, but even Bank of America is not large enough to absorb all these toxic assets.
Now, let's talk a little bit about who's getting the short end of the stick here. I mean, your group and your work, it's really you're fighting on behalf of a constituency, which are people in America that are getting screwed in the housing market. And and right now, 25% of the mortgage holders are still underwater. So, and all this fraud and abuse goes by unchecked, unprosecuted, if not lionized by the administration, who gives immunity to mortgage fraud with wholesale legislation to completely exonerate hardcore financial securities fraud in America. Now, what about the housing market going forward? Because after all, this is what we're talking about. This is what's at stake. Is this foreclosure nightmare going to continue to disenfranchise and impoverish America going forward?
It doesn't look good. Essentially, the policies the government has implemented in reaction to the crisis has been to drag things out as long as possible. And a number of the so-called foreclosure rescue efforts were completely ineffective. In fact, they were worse than ineffective until recently. It was likely to just delay the situation for most homeowners who were entrapped into it, if not to actually put them in a foreclosure situation when they had been told they would get a loan modification. Recently, things have gotten a little better with these programs because some of the bad press these outcomes were getting. But the scope of the problem is so big. This is the core of it. The banks inflated the property values so much in the bubble that they created this gigantic overhang in the mortgage securities, and they essentially can't work through the foreclosures quickly enough to bring a quick resolution to this crisis. And at the same time, they can't give the scale of principal forgiveness that would be needed, because it would wipe out most of the bank's capital for a lot of the big five banks as well as beyond.
Right, so the banks are holding these mortgages on their books for 100 cents on the dollar, and they claim to have a book value commensurate with that value. They can't mark it down, or the banks go bankrupt. Meanwhile, on the other side, the homeowner, they're getting screwed in that there's no path for them to resolve this crisis. They're ending up on the street, in the gutter, starving to death, to make sure that bankers don't look bad and get a good Christmas bonus. Well, that's America for you. Okay, Aaron Crown, that's all the time we have for this week. Thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thanks, Max.
And that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Aaron Crown. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.